Hi, my name is Kuda Mugara, and this video is solely for the developer. This will be going through the code, explaining the code in general, and how we came about the thinking process behind the coding, so that if there are any improvements the developer would like to make in future, they just follow this code. Now, first things first, let's just go to the Visual Studio platform so that we can take a look at the code. Let's start from the beginning, the very beginning, how the project is designed. It's in such a way that we have the solution itself, and within the solution we have different folders related to the project. For example, if you look here, we have the view, that is the entire project uses what we call MVC. I'll just clean this up for now so that everything becomes more organized. Yeah, now we have the model, we have the view, and then we have what we call the controller. The controller is with the model, the view, and the controller. There's the controller, there's the model, and the view. The controller communicates, it's more like a facilitator between the model and the view. Let's start from the model, which contains most of the important code in our program. Now, the first class that we thought about is the browser. Well, we should have a blueprint for designing a browser object. And if you look at the blueprint of the browser class, there are different methods, and we don't have many of the properties regarding the browser. The properties were kind of dissected into classes themselves. For example, in a browser you expect to have a history. Maybe someone could have done that. You expect to have a favorites as a property, but here we kind of made everything less coupled and independent of each other. If you look at the most important method of this class is the method for sending the request. Here it's just kind of compressed here. There's just using the region keyword. Send request method is compressed here. This is how the method starts. It starts from here and continues down here. But if you look at this, this is an async method which returns this object here. This object here belongs to the class of system_threading.task. And what we do here is we first create a client, an HTTP client, and then from the client we get an async. We initiate the call of an asynchronous call using the URL to initiate the communication between the client and the server. And now, within that call, what we get is an HTTP response message which will be assigned to this variable. And if you notice here, we use a question mark. The question mark is just a safety navigation operator, saying that if the call, the response is not null, just assign it to the variable. It's just to avoid the if and else conditions, which makes the code a little bit shorter. Next, what we do is we get the content. We just get the content by reading it as a string and assigning it to this variable called data here. And now, what we do is we concatenate the data with the result, because we start with a null value here, and we concatenate it with the data that we got from the call. And then there are a few exceptions we catch. For example, an HTTP request exception and the invalid operation exception. For example, if you put something wrong, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we expect to get this exception will be handled appropriately. And within the web browser, what you get is an HTML code, right? It's an HTML string. So the other task was to retrieve the title or the name of the web page. The question is, how do we do that? Well, what I thought of is, okay, let me take advantage of the properties of the, where is that method? Okay, the method is here. Here, this is the method responsible for returning if you read here, this method gets the title between the web page from the HTML title tags. Well, if you know HTML structure, usually the title of the page will be between the title tags. That is usually the name of the page. So I took advantage of this by coming up with a function that will get the string between the title tags. So it will always return the name, and then we assign it to the top of the page. At the top of the page of the view, which is the HTML view, we use this code to get the name and assign it at the top of the page. We will see that in practice in a few minutes. Another method that is very important regarding the web browser class is writing to a history file. Well, we have a history object, and then we want to write to a history file. The history file acts as a database for storing all our history, and we just use a stream writer, just a simple stream writer, making sure that we close or dispose of it at the end. And yes, if you notice here, this call here, these are asynchronous calls we are making here. They are using the using keyword to just make sure that we dispose of the resources when we are done. Yeah, if you look at this one, it just writes to the history database, and we call it database H. H just stands for database history. We just didn't want to make the words longer. And then we can also clear the history using this method, and the way we do it, we clear the history in such a way that we set the database. Our database, I remember we kept simple. It's just a file, a text file. By setting the file stream length to 0, it just automatically deletes the entire file, so that when you view the history again, everything will be set to 0, the file will be empty. And another method which I think is very, very important is this one, the deleting the favorite method. We'll see how it works in practice, but I'll just take you through it. It uses a lambda function with a combination of the link here. If you look at the link here, what happens is, first we create a temporary file, and then we choose certain lines that we want to keep where they meet a certain condition, such that they are not equal to what we want to delete. This is a favorite object that we will see how we retrieve from a certain view. We want to keep all the lines not corresponding to this favorite object, and then we want to write all the lines to the temporary file. And what we want to do is we want to move the temporary file to that and delete the original file, and then create a new file again using the temporary file. I think it could be improved, but still it's a good method. I like it. It could be improved. A combination of link and lambda reduces the code to a much more shorter version. Well, in this project, I wanted to challenge myself as well. It's cool to use all these advanced features, but at the same time, programming from first principles, it also makes the programming fun. So there are parts where I didn't use the link, there are parts where I use the link, there are parts where I use the stream writer, stream reader. It was just for the variation to see in terms of how well can we be creative. Another method is writing to a history favorite. The history is divided into two. There are history for favorites, and then there are general history. But what you have to know is that the history for favorites is also under the general history. Basically, it's just the way in which you'll see how we implement this as well. It's more like making a copy. We just take a subsection of the history in general and writing it to the history favorites. Okay, another class maybe that we should talk about is just the favorites class. This one is one of the shortest class. We basically needed this class for the favorites view in such a way that what we will do is we will read from a database here. We read from a database. After reading from the database, we pass the object that we read from the database through this constructor here. We use this constructor to create an object, and then we use this method to read from the database, and then we pass the object of this constructor here, and then we split that object in such a way that we place it nicely into our data grid view. So basically this class is more like a data binding source for the data grid view of the favorites. Yeah. The same logic applies to history, hash tables. In the history, if you want to view history, we kind of create this class so that we make it more of a binding data source. And if you notice here, the variables are public here. They're public, so that they are noticeable to the grid view. And all these two classes, the favorites and the hash tables, they all come from this class, history linked list. They all inherit the linked list, history linked list. I don't know if you notice here, they all inherit the history linked list. The reason being, there's some of the methods that we want to use of the history linked list, and also the obvious reason being that a history is also a history. Generally, the view of the history comes from the history linked list, makes sense, and the favorite as well comes from, it's a history as well, it's a history object, so it makes sense that we don't duplicate code, we just replicate what we already have there. Now, enough about the model. Let's go maybe to the controller. Yeah, the controller just has one big class that kind of facilitates communication, and maybe we should look at a few methods that might need some attention. For example, this method here update view HTML, it will always just update the HTML part of the code. Like it will always update the interface which shows the HTML. So it does this by getting the URL input and then running, remember the get method here. The get method is called get h, meaning get HTML. We just wanted to make it short as well. It takes the URL and then it passes through this method to get the HTML contents. But then we don't want to write everything to the history. It's possible that it doesn't go to the history. I mean, it doesn't. The call results in a null or an empty string. So what we do is we want to check, is it null? If it's not null, we write it to the history file, so that we guarantee that we visited that page. And we kind of involve some time measurement there between making the call and returning the results. We see how long it took for the web call to complete, and we display that on the pages or the interface, the HTML interface. Yeah, I think that's about it. And then we just attach certain properties, fix certain properties. For example, the title, like we remember the method that I showed you, we get the title. This is the source file. This is the first letter, this is the second letter, and then we get whatever is in between, which is going to be the name, and we attach it to the top of the interface. And after doing that, we hide the top page, for the main page, because we don't want to view it anymore unless there's a mechanism to go back as well. Now this one is an override, is an overload. It's an overload of this method. The reason being, there's a part where I have to use a variable here, and a little bit different, but not really. This one works from the interface, the HTML interface. It operates from the HTML interface. This one operates from the start page. That's why there is an overload here. And this method will just update the view history. It will just update the history page. If you want to view the history, remember the view history page, it uses a data binding source. Yes, it uses a data binding source, but in order for you to view the history, what happens here is we create a hash table. We read the database into a hash table, and then the reason being that we wanted to make sure that we have unique time points. Like we have, if we visit Google at a certain time, we don't want to visit it twice, so we don't want a repetition of Google being visited at the same second, same minute, or maybe same hour. So what we do is we read the data. Remember that we read the database of the history into the hash table, and now for each dictionary entry in the data, meaning the key and the value, we want to get the entry, we want to get the key, the time value. Okay, remember our history design such a way that you go to Google, www.google.com at a particular time. So there is an @ sign there which separates them. The way that I separate it again will be such a way that we get the key and then convert it to a string and put it as the time. That's the unique part. Time will always be unique unless excuse me. Yeah, time will always be unique. And then the website here will be the value converted to a string. And then remember, we have these two objects now, right? Remember what I said? We created the history hash table class in order to pass through the object and then feed it to the data binding source. That's exactly what we are doing here. We create this object, and then we pass it, we add it to the data binding source, and we show the history. So we do it for every object that is in the database. That's how it works. And yeah, I think that's about it with the challenging methods. And we do the same for favorites. We patch them into a hash table again, feed them into data binding source, and we show whatever we want to show. Basically, that's how it works. But maybe another method that I should talk about is loading. Because you see here, this method here, if we look at the references, let's find all the references. The references is here. Process load is called, when you load a favorite here, you call this process load here. Because when you, let's go to the implementation again. The way this works is, okay, let's say you want to load a favorite, right? You are at the favorites page. you click on the name of the favorites, and then you want to load that page. What is the process? This is what happens. This is exactly what happens here. What happens is we create a new browser object, and then we start our timer, and then we get here cell contents is the name that we clicked in. We want to get whatever is on the left or is on the right, whatever the corresponding URL. There is the cell contents here. Then we stop the time because we would have already had the data here fed into the variable. Now we stop the time, and then what we do is because we need to write that to the file history with the @ sign. Otherwise, it will just complicate the structure. Remember, our history is written by the website at a particular time, and then new date is new date 1. We create a new date corresponding to the time we are receiving the URL, then we write it to the history file, and the same follows. We just update the text box with the data HTML. We get the title of the page, we set it to the name, and then that's about it. Maybe something that I need to emphasize is where we use what we call is threading. We use some threading. There's some threading involved. Yeah, of course, with task even they use threading. But if we look at this method here, let's go to the view page. If we are at the history, the view HTML, this, let me close this. This is a picture box. It will simulate as the user presses add. It should simulate a loading process. Right now it doesn't do anything, but if we go to the add method, what you see here is a threading task. What happens here is, okay, when we press this button, we create a new browser controller. We create something that will initiate communication between the model and the view, and we tell it, okay, what do we want to do? We want to add this object to the history of the favorites. Because remember we are seeing the HTML, we want to add it to the favorites. Now, what we do here immediately is we set the picture box to true, but for a specific amount of time, and then we use this task.run with the lambda function involved as well. Lambda functions are really helpful, and we set it to be visible for only 3 seconds, and then after that we cancel it, the visibility to be false. That's the threading task involved here, and I think that will be it. Apart from any other thing, I think the rest will just be basics. But let me just take you through the process in summary. The code is just structured in that way. If maybe you go to google.com, let's go to google.com, and the page loading. Like I said, if you remember the thread that takes place, let's add this to the favorite. It runs only for 3 seconds. Watch this, it disappears, and you get the successful notification here. And even the history, there's a lot of history we've visited since I started this app. Let's clear the history. It should be empty now. It's nice and clean, very nice and clean. And yeah, so that's the entire process. And like I said, this part here where we review our favorites, remember we have a class which is the favorites in the model. What happens is we read the file. As we read the file, we pass whatever we are reading through a constructor. We pass it through the constructor so that we create these 2 objects, and then we place them nicely into these corresponding columns. And if we click on this name, we should be able to load the favorite again. For example, Apple. It's called Apple. We should be able to load Apple. And yeah, remember the get string between it returns this Apple at the top and says it there. The time, the reason why I'm measuring time, we want to display how long it took. This was very fast compared to other websites. And yeah, it also writes to the history as we go along. And then remember what we did is we went to Google first, and then we went to Apple. If we want to traverse back to Apple or to Google, we press the back button. It should take us back to it's a mistake. Google, made a mistake. It should take us back to Google. Now, if we look at the favorites again, there is the delete button. Because we have selected Google, it asks, do you want to delete Google from the favorites? If we select yes, it will notify that Google was deleted. from your favorites. And this method here, if we want to, let's take a deeper look into this method, the delete method. Perhaps it's something that I should talk about as well. Let's go to favorites, the view of the favorites. The view of the favorites is here. And let's look at this method. This method, the way it works is, it's possible that you don't have anything to delete. If you have anything to delete, you'll catch this exception, but you don't have to delete. Please some sites before deleting. Now, but assuming that there's something, what happens is, on that row, whatever you are, it gets the contents of the cell, and then it converts them to a string. And then what it does is, if it asks you, do you want to delete this object? Then if that's the case, it invokes the delete.fav method. If you go to the implementation, how does the method works? Let's just go to the final implementation. Remember that it's a very same method we talked about, which uses the combination of the link and lambda function to delete to keep everything that does not correspond to whatever variable we have passed here. The variable that is passed here is the contents of that cell, such that they correspond to the line within one of the lines in that excuse me, one of the lines in that text file. Yeah, I think that's about it. That's the general summary. I tried to make it as short as possible. I can't cover everything, otherwise the video will be 2 hours long, because this project even took a while to develop. But that's the main summary of the highlights. I will include this as a developer's guide in my report. Thank you.